Today I'd like to look at a game played by one of my students. His name is Mike, and he played this game at the Worcester Chess Club against a guy named Kyle. Kyle had the white pieces and opened with e4, and Mike responded with d6. Against e4, Mike tends to play the Perk defense, which is one of the hypermodern openings. And so, as is typical with a hypermodern opening, Black's idea is to get his entire kingside developed, allow White to kind of build up a center, and only after his king is safe and some of his pieces are developed, counterattack in the center. Typically in the perk, or heading into the perk, White plays d4, and then after knight f6, we get knight c3, Black plays g6, and White chooses what kind of perk he wants to play. In this case, Kyle played knight f3, and after knight f6, knight c3, g6, and d4, we've kind of backed our way into what you might call the classical variation of the perk defense. Black plays bishop g7, bishop e3 from White, Black castles kingside. So again, the idea is Black develops his kingside, gets his king to safety, has this nice fianchettoed bishop on g7. And at some point, he's going to strike back in the center or on the queen side to compensate him for the nice center that White has developed on d4 and e4. White played h3, presumably to stop the Black light-squared bishop from coming to g4. Mike played c6, and this kind of idea is normal in the perk, because one of the main ideas is to expand on the queen side with b5, and maybe play b4 afterwards, with the idea that this knight on c3 will have to move away, and then hopefully the e4 pawn will be undefended, and Black will be able to break down White's center. White played queen d2. I think kind of normal here for White is to play the move a4. There's probably more than one move White can play. But the idea behind a4 would be to stop b5 from Black. And it really does a pretty good job of that, because Black can't even try to add more support to b5 to play it on the next move. Because were he to play b5 next, it would turn out that the a-pawn is not actually defending b5. White could take on b5 a couple times, taking advantage of the pin on the a-file. And so Black would be compelled to do something other than play on the queen side here, and I think the right thing to do would be to move his knight to d7 in preparation for playing the move e7 to e5, striking or sort of counterattacking in the center. And in this kind of defense, again, which is called a hypermodern defense, you often have to be prepared to use tactics to equalize the game. And those tactics can be difficult to find sometimes. So here, for example, a move you should look at that is usually important to look at in this kind of opening is e5 for White, because it looks like it makes Black pretty uncomfortable. This knight on d7 is sitting on a square that the knight on f6 might like to use if it decides to retreat. But it turns out Black has a tactical way to solve his problems here, and this tactic is worth remembering, so I thought I'd show it to you. After d takes e5, d takes e5, Black can put his knight on d5, which at first doesn't look very good, because after knight takes d5, c takes d5, queen takes d5, White has won a pawn and is defending e5 twice. But what sometimes happens when one of White's center pawns in this opening is defended by the queen is that it turns out the queen is not a very good defender, and let me show you what I mean. Black can play the move knight takes e5. And while it's true that White is attacking the e5 square twice, White does not want to take on e5 with his queen first, because that would cost him a lot of material. And if he does something about his hanging queen on d5, for example, trading it off on d8, he's no longer attacking the e5 square twice. In fact, Black can even throw in this in-between move knight takes f3 check, destroying White's pawn structure, and only then take back on d8, and have what is, I think, an advantageous position. So again, that's kind of typical of hypermodern openings. You have to be prepared for your opponents to put you under a lot of pressure in the center, and you often have to use tactics to get out of the trouble. But if you can do that effectively with reasonable frequency, you'll find that you have a pretty good position afterwards. Okay, white didn't play a4 though. He played the move queen to d2. And this kind of signals a couple things from white. One is that he might intend to play bishop h6 and trade off black's fianchettoed bishop on g7. The other is that white might want to castle queenside at some point. And many of us have seen a certain trick that's sometimes used by a player who's in possession of a fianchettoed kingside bishop when he doesn't want that bishop to be traded off. And that's that he moves the rook out of the way, usually to the e-file. And after that fianchettoed bishop gets attacked, he backs it up to the corner. However, I've looked at a reasonable number of positions like this with a computer, and the computer almost never recommends this way of handling your bishop. Instead, the computer tends to think that if white goes through the trouble of going bishop h6 and bishop takes g7, black's best off finding something productive to do with those two moves and not moving his rook to the e-file and trying to save his bishop. So after queen d2, it might be tempting to play rook e8. Another reason you don't want to do this kind of thing usually is that sometimes the rook is not a very good piece on e8. There are times when a knight from f6 wants to retreat to that square, and other times when it's necessary to defend the f7 pawn, and the rook on e8 interferes with both of those things, or interferes with one of them and fails to help with the other. So after queen d2, Mike played the move b5, a move I'm very proud of him for, because he and I have talked about these ideas in the past. When black plays c6 in the perk, his idea is to expand on the queen side with b5, and maybe later to play b4, and even to go as far as to create a pretty strong dark square pawn chain on the queen side and in the center, with the idea that it supports this bishop on g7 in its attempt to exert a lot of influence over the long diagonal. So Mike followed through with his idea and played b5, ignored white's threat or seeming threat to put his bishop on h6 and trade on g7. Kyle went ahead with bishop to h6, and Mike and I in the past have worked a bit on recognizing that when you make a threat and your opponent doesn't stop you from executing on that threat, typically the next thing you should do is make good on your threat. And that's exactly what Mike did here. He played the move b4. So I mentioned a moment ago that you might have been tempted to move your rook to e8 and your bishop to h8, but that computers typically recommend finding something more productive to do. And that's exactly what Mike did here. He managed to move his b-pawn all the way from b7 to b4, and now that b-pawn is forcing the knight on c3 to move away, which will remove the defender of the e4 pawn. That's a lot of lines and circles, but I hope you get the idea. So Mike played b4, unafraid of the trade on g7. Kyle played knight to a4, and Mike, continuing with his queenside play, moved his queen out to a5. He's threatening the knight on a4. I think he should have handled the tactics here a little bit differently. I think the move knight takes e4 is very strong. Now that the defender of the e4 pawn is gone, you just jump in and grab the pawn, and white's got a little bit of a problem. His queen's under attack, but he has to move that queen to a square from which it still defends the bishop on h6, for example the e3 square. And after that, maybe black can just trade bishops on h6. White could take the knight on e4, but that would leave black with an unopposed dark squared bishop controlling very important diagonals. So white should retake on h6. And now maybe the move queen a5 would be pretty strong, with the idea that again the knight is under attack. This knight, if it needs to, on e4, can always retreat to the f6 square to guard h7. And at least for now, the queen is helping the knight prevent any of white's pieces from showing up on the g5 square. I think this would have been a pretty strong way to continue. Mike chose to handle things a little bit differently. He played the move queen a5 immediately. Kyle traded bishops on g7. No problem, says Mike. And then Kyle played e5, which didn't work out very well for him, but he didn't have much in the way of better moves. One idea for white might be to play b3, protecting the knight on a4. But then black gets to capture on e4, with tempo hitting the queen on d2. And after the move queen e3, which seems to be a double attack through a technique called X-ray, black can retreat to f6, and it turns out there isn't actually a capture on e7 by the queen, because rook e8 would win that queen. So this would be a nice way for, this would be another way for black to win a pawn. White did not play b3, but played e5. And this saves the pawn that was just on e4, but doesn't stop the knight from coming in and causing a lot of problems. So Mike, I think correctly, jumped in with knight e4. Kyle's knight is under attack and his queen is under attack. And the only way to handle that is to get the queen out of the way while counterattacking Mike's knight on e4. Mike captured the knight on a4. And white could capture here on e4 immediately, or he could do what he did in the game, which is play b3 as an in-between move, attacking the black queen on a4. Mike played queen a3, and it kind of looks like the material is coming out even here, but the problem for white is that after queen takes e4, black has this move, bishop f5, which Mike saw and played. And the bishop is attacking the queen on e4, and behind it the pawn on c2. And while the queen can move to a square from which it defends c2, now black can come in with the queen, queen b2, hitting the rook on a1 and the pawn on c2 for a second time. And the rook can't move to c1 to defend the pawn because it would be hanging there. Kyle played queen to d1, which allows Mike to capture this pawn on c2, and that's what he did. Kyle played queen c1, trying to hold on to the rook on a1. And Mike played queen c3. And this brings up an important idea in chess, which is that when you're attacking your opponent, and when your opponent's king is much more exposed than yours, you typically don't want to trade queens. Black's queen is much more of a threat to the white king than white's queen is to the king on g7. So Mike correctly played queen c3 check. Kyle defended with knight d2. Notice that if he puts the queen on d2 instead, he's going to drop that rook on a1. So he played knight d2. And now if you put yourself in black's shoes, the question is, how do you continue with your attack, if you can? You are up a pawn, which is great, but one pawn, while decisive a reasonable amount of the time, also offers the defender some drawing chances typically. So you'd prefer to be up more material than that. So if you're black here, how do you continue your attack? Well, an important thing to remember is that you should try to involve all of your pieces in the attack. Right now, black's attacking with the queen on c3 and the bishop on c2, but if he doesn't include more pieces, those pieces will eventually be outperformed by the knight on d2, the queen on c1, the rook on a1, and then once black castles kingside, the other rook. So Mike found a way to bring another piece into the game. He played d takes e5. Okay, so Mike takes a second pawn. Kyle recaptures on e5, but now the d file is open, and Mike goes rook d8, putting more pressure on this knight on d2. And it's worse than pressure, because Mike is now threatening to capture on d2, and if the white queen retakes, to take the rook on a1 with check. And in fact, I don't think there's anything white can do about that here. Kyle decided to try to get his king out of the way by playing bishop c4, which is, I think, reasonable. Mike followed through with his tactical threat and grabbed that knight on d2. And now black's much better pieces have led him to being up an entire piece. In fact, a piece and a pawn at this point, I think. And that's typically what you'll see in situations like this. When your pieces are much better than your opponent's, let's take a look at the queen on c3, the rook on d2, and the bishop on c2 compared to the queen on c1, the rook on a1, and the bishop on c4. Favorable tactics will start to show up on the board. And the nice thing about positions like this is that unless your advantage in piece placement is going to go away suddenly, you don't actually have to see the first tactic that shows up on the board. That's because your pieces are so much better than your opponent's that it'll tend to be the case that move after move, or maybe with a couple moves in between. Uh, I'm not redoing this video. I'm not going to do it. I've done it like 5 times already. What was I going to say? So when you have much better pieces than your opponent, you tend to have tactics that show up in the position over and over again. Black found this way to win a piece on d2, but he not only won the piece on d2, he won it in a way that did not get rid of his amazing piece activity. He still got this queen on c3, the bishop on c2, and the rook on d2. White's only good piece is this bishop on c4, but by itself it can't do very much. So black's up a piece and a pawn and has better pieces and is completely winning for that reason. White castles kingside. Alright, and another thing Mike and I have worked on in the past is making sure to, even when you have a really nice advantage and you're up material, making sure, I think I said this already, making sure to include all of your pieces in the attack. So how do we get these 2 last black pieces to be involved in Mike's attack? He can't really bring this knight out to a6 because it would be captured by the bishop on c4. If he doesn't move that knight, it's going to be very difficult to develop the rook on a8. So Mike, I think, correctly played knight to d7. And this kind of invites White to find some kind of counterplay with the move e6. But Mike didn't panic. He put his knight on e5 with the idea that I hope with the idea that black's only good piece is this bishop on c4. And so the knight can now trade that bishop off, at which point White will have no good pieces. Kyle played e takes f7. And I think there was a point in Mike's development at which he would have recaptured this pawn with the knight, but he's, I think, a significantly stronger player strategically now, and he understands that in a position like this, it's much more important to get rid of your opponent's good pieces. So he threw in the move knight takes c4. Kyle played b takes c4, and Mike only now recaptured the pawn on f7. Kyle played a4, which is not a good move, but there are no good moves here for White, and that's because of the tremendous activity of the black pieces and the fact that black at this point is up a piece. White could try to go for counterplay with rook to e1, but that just looks like it would get White immediately in big trouble after queen d4, hitting this f2 pawn and threatening checkmate in 2 moves. Queen f2 to g2. And if White tries to block that with rook e3, attempting to play actively, he immediately loses his queen to rook d1 check. So there's really nothing White can do here. Black has extra material and dominant pieces. Kyle played a4. Mike involved his last piece in the attack, rook a to d8. And Kyle played rook a2, looking for some kind of counterplay. But Mike played very solidly here. He understood that he was up a piece and a pawn, and that if only he could make sure all his pieces are involved in the attack and that they are anchored, this would be a very easy game to win. So he played b3, anchoring that bishop on c2, and who knows, maybe someday the b-pawn will become a second queen. Kyle played rook b2, and now Mike's able to jump in with rook d1. And there are problems here, of course, that White can't handle. If he takes on d1 with his rook, then the rook that replaces it will fork the king on g1 and the queen on c1. But if White just moves his queen away, then Mike's going to be able to capture the rook on b2. So it's pretty clear that I think now that we're nearing the end of the game. Kyle tried queen f4 check, which at least comes with tempo, but after king g7 there are no more checks. And now he played rook takes d1. There wasn't anything he could do to defend the rook on b2, and I'm tempted to say that it would actually be worse for White to play rook takes c2 than to just leave his rook on b2, because that brings the b pawn to the second rank, which means it's only one more move until Mike gets another queen. Rook takes d1, rook takes d1 check, king h7, and queen takes b2. Alright, and queen c7 from white, going for some kind of counterplay, forking these pawns on e7 and a7. Alright, and this is an important moment in the game, not because there's any hope for white to come back into the game, but because it's a time when black should take a step back and realize that he's up a tremendous amount of material, and realize that the best thing to do for practical reasons is not to try to play like a computer and find the fastest checkmate, in which case he might risk blundering some of the material back, but instead to play in a way that's very solid, that keeps his pieces safe and his king safe. And that's exactly what Mike did. He played queen to f6. The queen now guards the e7 pawn. It takes a look at the f2 pawn and the f4 and e5 squares, which might be useful checks later on. And it gets out of the way of the b pawn, which is now going to head down the board and become a queen. White played f3. I mean, there's not anything for white to do here. b2 from Mike. Queen takes a7, and we have a second queen showing up on the board with b1. a5, and Mike finds queen e5 check, which is a pretty fast checkmate. White has to block this check because his king can't move anywhere. So Kyle blocks it with g3, but now queen e2 check is mate into queen f2, and queen takes f2 checkmate. So Mike played really well. He's a kind of a funny student of mine in that he has this habit of playing excellent strategic moves and getting into positions in which he has all sorts of amazing tactics to win the game, but then somehow hanging everything and blowing himself up and losing the game. So I'm proud of him for not doing that in this game and kind of following through, playing solid moves, winning a bunch of material, and then checkmating the enemy king. Hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks.